Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Yuri Deigin. Yuri, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. There's lots to talk about at the moment. You've been especially busy concerning the issue of vaccine misinformation and Bret Weinstein specifically. Before we get into the details surrounding that, maybe you can just explain to my viewers and listeners what you do. How would you describe what keeps you busy?
Sure. I'm working on the gene therapy for aging or rejuvenation gene therapy. So I'm a drug developer, and this is my day job. And in between, I tend to investigate SARS-CoV illness. I guess I kind of gotten a little more exposure on Twitter last year after I published my Medium article on potentially SARS-CoV-2 being a lab leak, and this is how I got to know Bret Weinstein. And I guess if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to ask. I don't know how much more I know.
Right. So I mean, just that there would probably necessitate a full discussion, the lab leak hypothesis, and that was very interesting because it almost feels like a little bit of a win for the conspiracy theorist in the sense that the wet market explanation was the consensus. That's what we all thought. And we thought people merely suggesting that perhaps it came out of a lab were sort of kooks and cranks and a little bit crazy. And as time's gone on, that seems like the most likely explanation for this virus. So, I mean, when did you start putting that out there, and what kind of things can you point to back up the lab leak hypothesis?
Right. Well, I mean, I started kind of being skeptical about it pretty much as soon as I learned about it. I guess February of 2020 was like the initial time when I was just trying to understand where the virus came from, and initially just kind of trusting the scientists who have been saying almost pretty much from the start that no, it's just a coincidence that it happened in Wuhan where this lab is. And, initially I too just kind of trusted them and went with their opinion, but eventually decided to kind of make sure that the evidence they're using makes sense. And once I started digging into it, I realized that it doesn't, that there's really no evidence of, natural origin. And essentially what they're saying is that just because many or most previous infections or pandemics were started by zoonotic infections, then this one too must be zoonotic. But really, other than that, they don't have any other evidence to fall back on. But on the other side of the scales, there's just so many suspicious coincidences. First and foremost, the location. Why the hell would the natural outbreak occur in Wuhan, where this virus is not endemic to the region, and the only really connection of this virus to the region is the lab that's been collecting viruses like that, the lab that's been working on viruses like that. So, to me, that was the first red flag. And then once I started digging into it, I realized there's just so many red flags. And I just kind of put them all together in this write-up, the Medium article that, I published in April of 2020. And that kind of started me down the rabbit hole of investigating more and more. And then, we formed Drastic, the group that's been kind of investigating the origins as this open source kind of intelligence community. And, here we are today. A lot of the things that we discovered really are forming the basis of the lab leak hypothesis, or the foundation of the, evidential foundation for the lab leak hypothesis. And it seems like we did a better job than some of the intelligence services that really haven't produced so much more novel stuff other than what we've already discovered. So anyways.
Keeping in the realm of conspiracies then, I mean, are you inclined to think this...
It's not a conspiracy. So the conspiracy is the cover-up of Fauci and Daszak. That's a conspiracy, man. They're trying to essentially... They tried from the very beginning to kill the lab leak hypothesis. That was a conspiracy. They organized this Lancet letter without disclosing the huge conflict of interest that Peter Daszak has. That's a conspiracy.
Well, that's what I was going to sort of lead into. My question would have been, I think you pretty much answered it, but I was going to ask, do you think this is a product of just incompetence, or do you think there has been some aspect of covering up the origin of this virus?
Both. Definitely, China is definitely acting like it's covering something up. Virologists definitely have a huge conflict of interest, and they are preying that this is a natural outbreak, because if it's not, even if it occurred in China, there's so many other kind of strings attached to it, pointing to US funding and just international virologists' effort of gain of function, that if it is a lab leak, it's going to have repercussions for the whole field and their funding and everything else. So absolutely, they have every vested interest to make sure it's not the lab leak. And then there's also, yes, incompetence. It turns out that so many eminent virologists can't align genomes properly, and it takes internet sleuths using Google Translate like Drastic to actually point them out what the more parsimonious alignments are, and just so many things that we pointed out in the Proximal Origins paper of Christian Anderson, Holmes, and other eminent virologists. They were completely either wrong or irrelevant. The things that they presented as evidence was not evidential at all. So yeah, there's a bit of everything.
Okay, so just to be clear on this last point, so the lab leak hypothesis to me makes sense, and the evidence is mounting for it, and I'm in that camp. But there's also people that are already in that camp who would say that the virus was engineered intentionally and released as some sort of act of biological warfare, and I have seen lots of people posting that kind of thing. So just to be clear what we are and what we're not saying, are you in the position that this is a natural virus that was in the lab and has been leaked from the lab, or are you in the camp that would suspect that maybe this has been engineered?
Right. Well, we have to differentiate between engineered as a bioweapon and engineered as gain of function. And there's, a whole world of difference. And obviously, it could have been engineered as part of the efforts of gain of function research that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had a grant on, which specifically said using reverse genetics, which is shorthand for genetic engineering, using reverse genetics to ascertain what makes viruses bind better to human receptors. So in that explanation, definitely could have been engineered, and the furin cleavage side really looks to me as something engineered. Of course, everything can happen in nature. Whatever you can engineer can also happen in nature, but the odds of it happening in nature and actually jumping out of a lab that's been known to engineer things like that are, to me, astronomically low. In terms of bioweapon and deliberate release, no, I don't think at all this is a deliberate release by some government or by the Chinese intentionally to, kill a bunch of their own citizens for some, potential gain, or it's some sort of third government. The US is secretly releasing it in Wuhan. No, I don't think any of that for a second. The only deliberate release hypothesis I'm not ruling out is some kind of act of bioterrorism by a rogue, sole virologist, sort of like the anthrax mailings that we had in 2001, where it was a rogue US anthrax researcher that was, trying to make it look like an act of foreign bioterrorism. Basically, I'm not ruling out something like that could have happened in China. Maybe some crazy virologist thought that SARS-like viruses are not getting enough attention and decided to take it, upon himself or herself to remind the world of just how dangerous those viruses could be. And really, it's not out of the realm of possibility. So it's just could be some crazy terrorist. But more than likely, most plausibly, if this is a lab leak, it's a lab leak of something that they've been working on as just a research into vaccines, or in general, some kind of gain of function research for the purposes of figuring out how dangerous can this virus get. And they've been doing this for years, if not for decades. These scientists, coronavirologists, they've been studying viruses and trying to ascertain what's the dangerous mutation, what's less dangerous, which parts of the virus are responsible for making it dangerous for humans and which aren't. So I think it's just more than likely that this is just something from that kind of research that jumped out of the lab.
Given the anti-inquiry mentality of the CCP, to put it mildly, and their hostility towards the free press and dissenters in general, how likely do you think it is that we may get some truth, some answers eventually?
I think it's pretty likely, but it definitely won't come from China or from Chinese cooperation with this investigation. But thankfully, we have enough data outside of China, or that's been already published, already in the public domain, including Chinese language sources, PhD thesis, master thesis, thesis. But basically, yeah, there's open source data that I think still holds a lot of clues. Maybe from intelligence community as well. I think that the recent information that those 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology staffers that got sick in November with flu-like symptoms and went to the hospital, that they lost their sense of smell and that they had ground glass opacities in their lungs. To me, this is a huge revelation. Like, to me, that pushes like this almost to certainty that this was a lab leak. So all those sorts of things will eventually lead us to ascertain the truth. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, there's a still small chance that China will just kind of flip their position 180 degrees and be like, oh, we didn't know. It's just bad scientists. He or she's been lying to us. Now that we realize they've been lying to us, we're ready to admit to the world that this was a lab leak, but it's not our fault. We've been lied to. So it's still a small chance that China can do this, but more than likely they won't. But I think we'll still get to the bottom of it.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say you're an advocate for the vaccines. I am as well. I've had both jabs, and I try and use what limited platform I have to help encourage other people to do so. And I try and spread a lot of useful information and try to debunk a lot of the misinformation. And I think one of the issues you might have here as well is that we've just spoken about distrust of consensus in regards to the wet market leak and all the bodies and organisations around that who seemingly sang along with it, only to find out that it's very unlikely to be true. But now we're going to switch towards vaccines and say we should trust the consensus and trust many of the same bodies and organisations who were wrong in that instance. So how do we square that circle? How do we reject appeal to authority on one hand and then push appeal to authority in the realm of vaccines?
I think it's just 2 very different situations. I mean, one where with the origin of the virus, we had just so little information to go on. And basically the consensus was initially hijacked by a small but powerful group of virologists with inherent conflict of interest. And really small, I mean, probably, you can count them on 2 hands. But in the case of vaccines, this is completely different because we have a medical community of thousands of researchers, tens of thousands of doctors, and a lot of data from independent sources, different clinical trials with thousands or tens of thousands of participants. And all of those data, if we analyze it independently, we can draw our own conclusions versus, the lab leak, where essentially there wasn't any data for us to analyze on our own, other than the one, basically what we could dig up through our own efforts. But what in the case of vaccines, it's completely different. There's so much data; it's all open. Even adverse reactions data, virus system, the UK yellow card, everything is available for everybody else to draw their own conclusions. And pretty much, I think all reasonably smart and reasonably people with data analysis abilities, once they do analyze the data, they come to the same conclusions that vaccines are overwhelmingly more advantageous than COVID. So vaccines prevent a lot of, first of all, the infection, greatly reduce the risk of infection, and reduce the risk of bad COVID. So even if there's some inconclusive signal about like, are they completely safe, or is there like some minor danger? When you compare it to like the huge danger of COVID, it's no brainer which choice to make. And even if, vaccine efficacy is now waning in the face of Delta, this is not a reason not to vaccinate. It could be more of a reason to vaccinate because Delta is just so much more contagious. And so I think it's a very different situation. And just by virtue of having all those data available to pretty much anybody to draw their own conclusions, I think people can do do the analysis themselves. And even if they prefer someone else to do this analysis, they don't have to rely on like 1 or 2 virologists. They can rely on dozens or hundreds of different experts with really no conflict of interest. It's not like medical doctors want to jab you because Pfizer pays them for every vaccine. Absolutely not.
This term, vaccine hesitant, has been thrown into the discussion now. And to me, it seems indistinguishable from anti-vaxxer. in that sense. But I'm trying to be charitable and wonder if there is some sort of distinction to be made, because I feel I'm somewhat primed for this discussion on vaccines, because I spend a lot of my time, certainly did many years ago, focusing on the issue of religious fundamentalism, and wrapped up in that was sort of anti-scientific worldview, and specifically a distrust of vaccines. So it was either ultra conservative Christians or people living in the west coast of America just seemingly had this idea that vaccines were linked to autism and government control, and it got crazier and crazier. And I'm seeing a lot of that reflected in the conversation we're having on the COVID-19 vaccines now. However, people will say, look, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've had my children vaccinated. I've been vaccinated in the past, but this is new. This is a new kind of vaccine. This is a new kind of virus. I'm a little bit concerned about the long-term effects and ramifications of taking this vaccine. Do you give people any sort of slack for that mentality versus somebody who's deep into the rabbit hole of conspiracies?
I think I do, and I make the distinction between a vaccine hesitant person that's just asking questions and not really regurgitating anti-vax misinformation. That is definitely anti-vax, things that are either completely false to begin with or have been proven false already, but they just get recycled, and people who are posting those things or saying those things are anti-vaxxers, and people who enable them are anti-vaxxers, like Bret Weinstein is an anti-vaxxer, Robert Malone's an anti-vaxxer, Steve Kirsch is an anti-vaxxer, Pierre Corey is an anti-vaxxer, and those are anti-vaxxers. They promote misinformation that poisons the minds of people who, can't make their own analysis, and those people could be vaccine hesitant, right? They become hesitant because of anti-vax misinformation. So that's the distinction for me, at least. So, and definitely there was a reason to be hesitant. It's a new drug, new technology, mRNA, and early last year, it was, absolutely reasonable to be hesitant because there's been so little data about these vaccines. But by this point, there's just so much data in terms of both efficacy and safety that I don't think it makes sense to be hesitant. Especially, you have to compare the risks of vaccines versus COVID. It's not vaccine versus nothing. If I don't take the vaccine, I'm just going to, live happily ever after and be healthy without the risks of the vaccine. No, if you don't take the vaccine, you're risking COVID. And it's pretty much guaranteed with Delta's transmissibility that eventually, if you don't get vaccinated, eventually you'll get Delta. And the risks of that are like way, way higher than anything, and even potentially dangerous about vaccines. And now we know they're not dangerous. Like the threshold of danger for any novel drug has already been proven that vaccines kind of fall under it, right? If danger is high, no, it's not high. Like deaths are very low. Various deaths we know were not caused by vaccine because there's no correlation between the rate of vaccination and the deaths. We see that the death can be explained by just the fact that we vaccinated older people first, oldest and most vulnerable, who have a background mortality rate, and just basically they're dying as they would be even if we didn't vaccinate them. And this was kind of causing initial signal that we had to investigate. But once we kept vaccinating people younger and younger, expanding the eligibility criteria, the various deaths were actually decreasing, right? So basically, we're not vaccinating older people anyway who have high mortality rate. We're starting to vaccinate younger and younger people, and we see lower and lower potential deaths from vaccines. And then when we investigate them, when the CDC investigates them, they realize it's not caused by vaccine. So basically, the background rate of whatever events we observe in vaccine, there's really no causality there in terms of deaths. So I guess at this point, I think it's just very unreasonable to still remain vaccine hesitant in the light of everything we know today.
I agree. The most reasonable and rational decision at this point in time would be to get vaccinated, any of the vaccinations at your first available opportunity. That's my position. You mentioned Bret Weinstein there. Weinstein or Weinstein? It's Weinstein, isn't it?
I don't know. I think it's fine either way. It's the last name. People, some carriers of that last name pronounce it differently. Some like Weinstein, some like Weinstein. So
Okay.
I think
Well, I mean, Bret came to many of our attention with the whole evergreen controversy. He seemed to be somebody who stood fast for free expression and scientific inquiry. And obviously that doesn't make him an expert in everything. And I think we're starting to see that now. And he's got this huge platform, this huge influence. And before we discuss the specifics and him in general, the main the main thing surrounding this is the issue of a drug called Ivermectin, which is not a new drug. It's a very old, widely used drug. And this is being pushed as some sort of panacea for COVID in terms of maybe a prophylactic. Some say it's an outright cure, depending on who you speak to. So it might just be a good point at this time in the conversation just to ask you, what is ivermectin and what's its primary use?
Sure. Well, so ivermectin is an anti-parasitic agent, anti-worming agent that's kind of been discovered, I guess, over 40 years ago, and it's mostly used for veterinary uses against worms of, animals that don't have good dietary hygiene and like humans do, and they just eat pretty much, everything, and they ingest worms with their food, and just to, let them live a little more happier lives. That's why those owners of those animals, worm, cattle, whatever, use ivermectin to get rid of those worms. But it also is used in some poor countries, again, as an anti-parasitic agent, because some of these same kind of parasites can cause very, unpleasant human conditions like river blindness, whatever. So it's used in Africa, and it's been used pretty widely. Some claims between 1 billion doses and 4 billion doses. But the way it's used and I think that includes veterinary use, though. But in any case, basically the use as an anti-parasite, they use it just once a year or maybe once, every few months to just kill the larvae or the actual worms that are inside your body. Nobody ever used it on a weekly basis, as this FLCC Alliance or the Bird Alliance now suggests people use it as a prophylaxis. And the story why ivermectin all of a sudden became this kind of COVID magic drug is pretty similar to every other quack magic drug like hydroxychloroquine or whatever that's been popping up as a COVID magic bullet. As is kind of usual with something new pandemics. There's always effort to find magic cures, something that like quickly will just get rid of the danger. And people try to repurpose drugs all the time. And for COVID, there was a huge repurposing efforts, basically looking at whatever's already approved for use in humans. So we know it's reasonably safe. Can we try and maybe it will either, stop COVID from, if you're already infected, from spreading it further, or maybe cure it from COVID. And on the other hand, maybe it could be prophylactic, as it will prevent you from catching COVID in the first place somehow. So, the hydroxychloroquine was the previous ivermectin initially in the pandemic.
Is that the one Donald Trump floated as a potential cure?
Pretty much, right, yeah. Okay. I think initially it was just chloroquine without the hydroxy modification, but then hydroxychloroquine was kind of the next favorite of drug quacks. And then ivermectin, it just popped up in some in vitro studies. Some, people tried it in a petri dish and said, "Oh, look, huge doses of ivermectin actually, reduce the viral load in these cells. Why don't we try it in humans as well?" Of course, the first problem was that the dose they used in those in vitro studies was 10 times or more than 10 times, up to 30 times more than whatever's ever observed in humans in like the blood concentration of ivermectin. But still, some doctors decided, why don't we try it? The drug's already approved. In some countries, it's already approved for human use. And as, they say it can't be that dangerous because so many billions of people used it. So why don't we try it in humans as a COVID prophylactic? And so all of a sudden, there were a bunch of small observational studies or very small interventional studies where observed some sort of effect. And that was enough for a lot of doctors to just blindly trust those studies and just start touting ivermectin as this kind of magic cure for COVID or magic prophylaxis for COVID. And probably the biggest study was the Argentinian study, which showed like completely unbelievable numbers that, out of 600 people taking ivermectin prophylactically, 0 got infected with COVID within the month period, versus a control group in which in one hospital, up to 92%, like over 92% of people in the control group not taking ivermectin got infected with COVID. And to anybody with even, the token understanding of statistics or drug development, that's a huge red flag. I mean, you don't really see such things, in any reasonably constructed clinical trial. But for people who are unfamiliar with drug development or not that good at data analysis, or just, anyway, so to them it seemed like, oh my God, this is the proof that ivermectin must be a magic drug. And so this is what they cling to very quickly. But, once you cling to something, it's really hard to let go, especially if you don't have enough, mental acuity to understand what's kind of been blinding you to get you attached to something in the first place. And so we got these, Pierre Corys of the world who formed this FLCC alliance and think that they've gotten some really secret knowledge that somebody else is trying to suppress, and that they can see that these studies are showing that ivermectin is this magic drug, and everybody else is just too blind or too corrupt to realize this. And and then I guess Bret noticed them, and he couldn't pass up such a great I wouldn't want to say conspiracy theory, but I don't know, such a great material to amplify on him being such a great contrarian, that he decided to latch on to this ivermectin saga, which for some reason came with the baggage of vaccines or anti-vax messaging, pretty much. For some reason, those two go hand in hand, which is weird. And for some FLCC people, like today, I forget his name, one of the former FLCC members was just having an interview with David Fuller, and he said, like, he didn't sign up for the anti-vax messaging. He signed up for ivermectin could be effective messaging, but why did it have to come with, vaccines are dangerous and get babies born with split brains messaging? I don't understand either why those two have to come hand in hand. I mean, I sort of do, because otherwise, why would you even want ivermectin if vaccines are safe and effective? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Like, I can understand in the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't have vaccines, okay, ivermectin, prophylaxis, or in some countries that don't have vaccines, okay, maybe. But now, when we have vaccines that have been proven safe and effective, to tout ivermectin in that scenario is just, it doesn't make any sense. And maybe that's why they have to kind of, if you like ivermectin, you have to believe vaccines are dangerous to justify you taking ivermectin.
Sure. So, I mean, it might be important just to sort of state Bret Weinstein's position. I appreciate he's not here, but I mean, in a nutshell, this is somebody who has a large reach, a large audience, a podcast. He's openly said he won't take the vaccine himself because he's not convinced on the safety, and he's touting this alternative of ivermectin. He's taken it live on a podcast himself. He's took it on tour to news channels and pushed this drug. He's done it on Joe Rogan. I think he did it on Tucker. So this is having a huge reach, and every time I drop into his tweets or his comment sections and things like that, I see people discussing where they can get ivermectin. So this is obviously having an influence. But from what I'm getting from you, it seems that this disagreement about the efficacy of ivermectin just comes down to an inability to properly read studies and judge their veracity. Is that generally what it is in a nutshell?
Yes.
So what is it that you can see in these studies that Bret can't, and why is Bret a seemingly intelligent human being? Why is he unable to see what you can see? And even when that's pointed out to him, how is he not able to correct the record?
Well, the second part is a whole different issue that, probably needs a psychoanalyst to answer. But the first part is easy. I mean, I've been looking at thousands of studies for the past over a decade, and I can spot things that are plausible and things that are not plausible. And also you have to kind of keep in mind the aggregate. If there are many studies, you get a knack for like which ones are more trustworthy and which ones aren't. Whereas this meta-analysis essentially like completely believed everything, all of the studies as, first of all of them as true and all of them as kind of equally effective. And when you do this, that kind of meta-analysis can really fool you into believing something that is really has a very shaky foundation. And I just don't think Bret is equipped with that knowledge or that experience to assess clinical data, preclinical data. And that's pretty much what it comes down to. And it's not just me, it's, dozens or hundreds of professionals, drug developers who weighed in on this and said, wait a second, this ivermectin meta-analysis, it's really, badly done. The conclusions it reaches are not well substantiated. And when the meta-analysis is done right, or the review analysis, like the Cochrane analysis done right, it reaches a completely different conclusion that there's no convincing evidence whatsoever to use ivermectin right now. It's not the data that are trustworthy are not proving there's any efficacy of ivermectin, are not conclusively showing that ivermectin should be propagated in humans. And moreover, now we have 6 good clinical trials, which are, they're better than a meta-analysis of garbage studies, because these are precisely done clinical trials in one context with thousands of patients. When they're done properly, these studies reported, again, confirmed there's no efficacy signal in ivermectin, nothing convincing, and moreover, it could be even more dangerous. Like one Argentinian study reported that ivermectin is associated with 5-day quicker progression to ventilation. So like people on ivermectin, when they are hospitalized, might require ventilation 5 days sooner than those who are not taking it. And this is a pretty troubling signal. So just if you actually know how to analyze clinical data, you won't come to a conclusion that ivermectin is something at all that should be used at all, or definitely not as an alternative to vaccines.
Yeah, I'm going to make the obvious joke everyone's been making, but it is ironic that a group of people committed to using the word sheep are now taking an animal drug. So I've seen these studies that has shed huge doubt on the efficacy of ivermectin, and they all seem, like you say, rigorous and done properly. So there's no way that Bret hasn't seen these too. Do you know if he's publicly acknowledged these studies?
I don't believe so. Actually, I think he pretty much ignored them. And that's kind of what. The more this went on, the more it made me question his sincerity and his good faith that, maybe he's not after truth-seeking after all, or at least his ego is definitely blinding him to being an honest truth seeker. So you
co-wrote a piece for Quillette, and who was your co-author on that piece again?
Claire Berlinski. She was, I'm the co-author and she's the main author. She's really, it's her baby and I'm just contributing father.
Great. Well, I shall link to that in the description of the show so people can read it. And that was widely spread around, and you received a little bit of pushback, I think mainly regarding your tone. It came across as somewhat attacking.
Yeah, pretty much.
I tend to feel this is kind of, the stakes are high, and I think we can forgive a bit of maybe high invective, or well, not so much invective, but passionate language, shall we say. But there was a promise from Bret and his wife Heather that there would be some sort of written response to this. And how long has your piece been out for Quillette? And do you think that a proper response is still forthcoming?
Okay, so we published, I think, July 6th, something like that. So almost 2 months now. They did promise that, they're going to publish point-by-point refutation. Then they had a podcast in which they kind of went through some points and which they think they disproved some of our points, but in reality, they actually did the opposite. They just showed how incompetent they are and just they don't understand clinical development or drug development or data analysis. And then what Heather did, which she claims she did in co-authorship with Bret, but I actually have some doubts, she put out this Substack piece, which actually is like probably 90% of something else, and 10% just kind of regurgitates a little bit of the pushback or analysis they did on their podcast in relation to our article. But again, it does not go point by point of all the arguments that we make. So, but again, some people are actually asked directly in the Q&A, like, are you going to address Berlinski and Deigin's claims, points, as you promised? And it seems that Bret and Heather are now thinking that their Substack piece of Heather published on her Substack channel does that, and they're not planning on doing anything in addition to that.
So I mean, it's probably important to point out that you were on friendly terms with the Weinsteins. You'd appeared on the Dark Horse podcast to talk about the lab leak hypothesis, seemingly friendly terms. So you're not somebody who's just an out-and-out critic of Bret and has picked up on this, Ivermectin fiasco. You're on friendly terms. So, I mean, I've seen you try and reach out again in order to arrange another discussion. Bret seems reluctant, to say the least. Is there an opportunity still? Has the bridge been burned in that sense? Do you think there's a way you two could sit down and have a discussion? Would that even be useful in your view?
I don't know if that'd be useful. I mean, personally, I'm willing to, I repeated many times, I'm willing to debate anybody, anytime, or not even debate, but just I'll talk to anybody. I don't think we're any longer on friendly terms with Bret, but still, if he wants to talk about things, I'm more than happy to engage. Now, the question of whether I reached out to him, yeah, absolutely. I reached out to him on multiple occasions, just privately by email, on Twitter. I suggested we actually do some kind of like public debate about this before Quillette piece. Like many times I said, Bret, I think, this and this and this are wrong. Corey is wrong. Gert Vandenbosch is wrong. Steve Kirsch is spectacularly wrong. Why are you not distancing yourself from these wrong messages? And we had, a little bit of a debate about ivermectin half-life on Twitter. And I tried to make a case that, even if you think it's efficacious, a weekly dosing regimen doesn't make any sense because of its short half-life. So that was all before the Quillette piece. I mean, he just never wanted to engage pretty much, neither in a written debate on Twitter nor in a verbal debate in any podcast form. So we put out the Quillette piece, and then he tweeted that, he's going to embarrass me with his refutation of our article. And I said, and it made it seem as if he's inviting me to the podcast on Monday. And so I thought, okay, if you want to, I'll go onto your podcast. Monday's good. And then he's like, I'm not inviting you to anything because you've been a jerk or something. And I'm like, okay. That was just after the Quillette piece. And I actually think I was reasonably nice up until then to him. And I mean, even the tone of the Quillette article, if you thought maybe that was just me being a jerk. But in any case, so yeah. And since then, I don't think I've ever suggested I go onto his podcast. He definitely didn't invite me, but not because of me. I mean, as I said, I'm always open to debate even the fiercest of my critics or enemies. I'll happily debate Malone, Kirsch, whoever. I don't care, however mean they might be or what, basically any format. But in terms of usefulness, to be completely honest, I don't even know the podcast format. I don't think it's that great of a forum for establishing truth. Basically, you get people just verbally going at each other, and instead of sharing data and science, I think the written format is much more conducive for establishing truth. That's why we put out the Quillette piece. And we were hoping to get, the Weinstein or Bret and Heather's written response, which can very, precisely articulate what evidence do they have for believing this or that claim. And they never really did it. And even in their written responses, they all just fall into this pretty much bullshit, postmodernism, social issues, FDA is captured by big pharma. Forget about that. Let's talk evidence. Let's talk data. Okay, here's the clinical data for ivermectin. Here's the clinical data for vaccines or whatever. Let's debate that. Just don't give me all your, blah, 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 which you're so good at, but obviously you're not really good at actual science. So if you're not good at science, you shouldn't be making those claims. You shouldn't be, telling people to not tell people to take ivermectin, wink, wink,
Yeah, I think that's I mean, that's thrown up a bit of an ethical quandary for me, because I'm somebody who staunchly believes that bad ideas, when adopted, will certainly lead to bad consequences, certainly bad behavior, depending on the idea. And I suppose that was something that was highlighted, and you highlighted this too with the case of Leslie Lawrenson. This is a man from the UK. Seemed like a fairly bright individual, well educated. He was a big believer that COVID wasn't very serious. He'd refused the vaccine, and he died at home from COVID. And it was later discovered that he was a big proponent of Bret Weinstein's. He'd shared many of Bret Weinstein's Dark Horse podcasts via his social media on the issue of Ivermectin and the vaccine, and provided his own commentary. And it seemed that he was very much influenced by Bret's output on this topic. So there's this issue here for me between bad ideas informing bad behavior, which clearly happens, versus the concepts of personal agency. And you took a very direct position on this, and you outright held Bret personally responsible for this man's death. Now, I certainly think there's definitely something to this, but it also made me feel very uncomfortable at the same time. And I'm not sure how I feel about holding him personally responsible, albeit I think that his output is certainly culpable in leading to these deaths. So do you still feel the same way about that comment? Was that comment that you made in the heat of a bit of passion on the news of this man's tragic and unnecessary death, or is this something you staunchly stand by?
It was definitely made in the heat of passion, and it's definitely something I stand by. I think Bret's anti-vax messaging contributed to Leslie Lawrenson's death. And not just his death. I think there's many countless other deaths that we haven't heard about that have been contributed to anti-vax messaging propagated and amplified by Bret and Heather. So it's as simple as that. I mean, they're not 100% culpable, probably not even, well, I don't know, in the legal sense, you could make a case that, wrongful death, that the messaging that, they promoted, and to people who were their fans before, that they could have contributed in some part to people not getting vaccinated, that could have led. I mean, legal, issues I don't even want to get into, but like ethical issues. I definitely think this is something that will weigh on their conscience forever. So that's something that they'll have to live with, and hopefully, eventually, they'll atone for it. But, if not, I don't know. So,
I mean, this is very difficult in the sense that we have this amazing socially interconnected group of supercomputers now. We all have the whole world in our pocket. We can all find our own little echo chambers of reinforcement. I can go and find content that all it does is bolster my pre-existing biases about the world in general. And that's all fun and games until we have a public health crisis, I suppose. And It's been especially dangerous during this pandemic. And the big tech giants are doing what they can to sort of take down content they find to be false and misleading. And there is some overreach from them as they're trying to figure it out. Where do you fall on the area of freedom of expression in terms of people like Bret being able to propagate misinformation about vaccines and ivermectin to the detriment of real human beings, versus a case for censorship for that kind of thing?
As much as I disagree and hate the messaging of Bret and Heather or anybody or any other anti-vaxxer, I can't support censorship just by virtue of having grown up in a heavily totalitarian censored country. I know that, censorship is a very slippery slope and just something that cannot ever stand. And whether it's censorship by big tech or, government, I'm against censorship. I think, good ideas will ultimately prevail over bad ones, and we have to. But if you actually start censoring bad ones, you get into the Streisand effect that they're actually amplified. This is what happened with Bret's podcast once it was removed from YouTube. Like people say, "Oh, this must mean that's true." So I'm against censorship, but that doesn't mean that I'm against responsibility or legal ramifications of misinformation. Like, you're free to say whatever the hell you want, but just be aware that if it causes people to die, that can come back and, lead to, again, legal issues with whatever you said. If that was obviously misinformation, I mean, it's a question whether it's known misinformation, like if you believe it to be true. There's all different like shades of what legal culpability is. And then probably, this is not the place to get into it, but just something that you have to be aware of. And this is the problem when people are very certain of their positions, and when they propagate them in the context of, I'm saving the world, or this is an emergency podcast because, big pharma or big tech are censoring this miracle drug. That's definitely much more dangerous than you just, is an academic seminar, as Bret is then kind of backpedaling, like, I'm not responsible for you modifying your behavior. If you were convinced by me, I'm still not, culpable if you something that I convinced you about then killed you. This was just like academic seminar. So there's kind of this disconnect, and I think just kind of sort of backpedaling going on once kind of he realized that maybe his messaging is not as accurate about this. Vaccines are dangerous, or ivermectin is a magic bullet stuff.
Yeah, I think the ego aspect with Bret really planted a red flag for me early. This, like you've just touched on, this idea that he's saving the world, like he's on a one-man quest of discovery that's going to end the pandemic. The people digging around very rarely overturn that much scientific consensus overnight. So I suppose what my general concern is, or my hope would be, to convince people on the fence who haven't been vaccinated yet, who still have some concerns about safety. And it's very difficult at this point not to be frustrated and be discourteous with these kind of people, depending on what, position they're coming from. How can we better have this conversation in terms of dispelling some of these myths? Because I was giving this some thought the other day. I tended to think my government in the UK wasn't so great at standing up there publicly and dispelling a lot of the conspiracies and misinformation. But then I sort of felt that was probably by design. By them not doing that, they're not also amplifying these ideas that other people wouldn't have heard anyway. So how do we draw that line between publicly dispelling misinformation and promoting it at the same time, sort of like the Streisand effect?
I don't know, man. It's hard. I've been
help me, Yuri.
Struggling with this for months, and it just seems that they're just more of the anti-vax. Like the more you push back against them, the more of them are coming back with even dumber stuff and like new stuff. Like, you dispel prion disease rumors, and they come up with, AD is now the fear du jour, that vaccines are going to cause ADE.
What's
and even the
ADE?
AD, like antibody dependent enhancement, basically, that prior immunity might somehow actually on subsequent reinfection might actually be worse. And initially what AD was observed in different viruses like dengue or MERS coronavirus. It's a very different form of AD that actually anti-vaxxers are talking about now. But basically all of those fears and concerns are completely unsubstantiated. And but they just keep coming up with new ones, like, Malone just recently came out again with vaccine that breed new variants. And he was so happy about he misunderstood a soundbite from NBC, and then he went on some other TV programs like, now we know vaccines are actually causing a higher viral load or something. And actually, that was in relation to AD, I guess. But there's just so much misinformation every day. It's because it's so much easier to come up with stupid stuff to be afraid about than actually going out and dispelling it with fact-based analysis. And nobody even most of the people who are swayed by anti-vax information, they're not going to read your scientifically based rebuttal. They're just going to share the YouTube clips. And this is the power of memes, right? Memes, once they kind of capture your brain, it's very, very hard for you to get rid of it. And of course, also, unfortunately, the level of intelligence susceptible to this brain capture is not conducive to then kind of getting rid of that brain capture. So basically, that's why I call all this misinformation kind of the dumb fuck filter. Basically, people who are susceptible to it, unfortunately, yes.
There we go. We've just lost any hope of convincing anyone to get jabbed. But I mean, I suppose my next question is this sort of anti-vax mentality, is it a uniquely American in the Western world? I mean, I'm in the UK. We still have. Pardon?
I wish, but no. Russia is probably the world leader in amongst the developing countries in the lowest vaccination rate in the population.
That was going to be my next question, because I mean, the UK, we have our fair share of sort of anti-lockdown disquiet and protest, but the vaccine uptake's actually been fairly promising. I know Toronto's Canada seems to be doing well. Been speaking to my Canadian friends about this. America. So America's not particularly a unique case. I mean, there's a theme of freedom and liberty at all costs that runs through American blood, and a distrust of big government and government overreach that plays into this a little bit, isn't there?
You're right. Yeah, and again, it's just somehow it correlates. Like the vaccination rates are much higher in the more kind of educated places in the United States, California and the Boston, Massachusetts area, probably New York up there. And then, down in the South, for some reason, the rates are dismal. So, I don't want to lose any more viewers. So I'm not going to make any further inferences. But for some reason, I don't know what it is about Russians, man. But the Russians are like the worst anti-vaxxers ever. Even like in Canada, in Toronto, like the Russian communities are so predominantly anti-vax that like even I'm losing friends here over it. That just they're like, oh, you're a pharma shill and you're trying to. Anyways, so it's crazy. And in Russia proper, like dismal vaccination rate. People are just distrustful. I don't know of what. It's not, I don't know, government, big pharma, like put it all together. And maybe it's just excuses for distrusting new medicines or something. I don't even know what it is. But for some reason in Russia, just former USSR, like the kind of Eastern Bloc countries, for some reason, they're just very conducive to anti-vax messaging. And I mean, the smart people, some educated people, for some reason also are distrustful of vaccines. Of course, they're much easier to convince once you kind of present the data that they change their mind. But anyways, I don't know what it is. It's a pandemic within a pandemic. Someone said, like the misinformation and idiocy pandemic that's kind of sweeping the world in parallel with the COVID.
I suppose the irony of this, I mean, you were talking about the potential for new variants as a product of vaccination, which obviously isn't true. But the reality is the longer that people remain unvaccinated, the more opportunity there is for a new variant. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, the longer time the virus has to come up with novel mutations, the more chance it has to do so. And once it does, if it breaks through the existing immunity, it doesn't matter what immunity, from vaccines or from previous infection, basically. So the claim that it's the vaccines that somehow create this pressure is completely wrong, because it's any sort of immunity does present an evolutionary pressure. If a novel variant arises that can, break through the existing immunity, it'll get an advantage in the population has been previously immunized by vaccine or previous infection. But of course, vaccines can quickly take away all of the kind of uninfected pool in which the virus can experiment. And of course, when they do so, they also do it safely. They don't kill, they don't have COVID gives you immunity, but it can kill you. And it has the other negative long-term effects potentially. Vaccine does not. And vaccine can be rolled out very quickly and produce this kind of immune defense that will stop the virus from experimenting, or greatly reduce the opportunity for the virus to experiment. So I don't like, it's a win-win situation to keep vaccinating people. It prevents them from dying and also decreases the ability of the virus to come up with novel variants. So for some reason, some evolutionary biologists seem to be unable to grasp that very simple context. They just focus on, like, very narrowly on the evolutionary pressure, and they completely ignore the kind of underlying mechanism of actually responding to that evolutionary pressure. And the mechanism is creating novel mutations. And to create novel mutation, the virus needs people. And the more people it has, the more chances it has to create novel mutations. And conversely, the fewer people it has, the fewer, like, you lower the risks of novel variants if you take away all these experimental kind of breeding pods for the virus to come up with those mutations.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. I mean, just thinking about the problems we have with people not taking the vaccine, obviously conspiracy plays a huge part, and misinformation, just pretty much one and the same. Is there something psychologically more sinister to human beings about a needle? If we could get people protected with a pill or a patch or a nasal spray or something else, do you think we'd see a bigger uptake? There seems to be this, even for myself, someone who's not afraid, who's not been pulled in by any misinformation. I'm not really afraid of needles either, but there's something just a little bit off about being jabbed with a substance directly into your body that just feels intuitively wrong. Is there something to this needle aspect?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't think it's huge, but it could make a difference for some people. And I mean, there are working on some nasal formulations of vaccines, but I don't know how effective those will be. But I don't know if I don't think it plays a major role. Like, you could probably kind of test this hypothesis and just have some kind of a poll among the anti-vaxxers. Like, if we had the same vaccines as pills or as nasal spray, would you take them? I bet, the conversion rate will be pretty much negligible. So yeah, I don't think that is really driving the vaccine hesitancy.
All right, Yuri. Well, thank you for coming on and speaking to me and speaking very clearly about a very important and consequential topic. I'm glad you dedicate a lot of your time to sort of pushing back against the misinformation and the promotion of drugs that don't appear to work during a very difficult and dangerous time. Is there anything else you'd like to say or point people towards before I let you get back to your afternoon?
I think pretty much we covered everything about ivermectin and vaccines in whatever format we can have in the podcast. But really, like, if people are still hesitant and really want questions answered, I think kind of the best way to do so is just to, Google and read actual respectable sources, scientific publications or large publications in respectable media, not like, websites that you don't even know the URL. Like, some people are sharing links to some articles on some really shoddy websites. Just kind of practice good hygiene, informational hygiene. Just you practice good, food hygiene. You should practice good informational hygiene and really vet the sources of information that you're using. So
that's great advice. All right, Yuri, thank you very much for speaking to me.
My pleasure.